Ari Melber, thanks for appearing on the UpTake. Tell us about your perspective at Netroots Nation, what brings you here, and what are you most excited about?
Sure. Well, I had a good conversation this morning at a keynote session with Van Jones, who's a green jobs advocate who also served for 6 months in the Obama administration but ultimately resigned. Really in a similar situation like what we've seen with the most recent Breitbarting of Ms. Sherrod, where quotes and other things taken out of context and other sort of history basically ruin someone's name in short order. So we talked about that, and what he said is that, part of what we have now is all these new media platforms, and it's a bit like sort of a new hit to the immune system, that you don't have the immune system in sort of how the media in our society deals with new information and videos and fast-moving information. And so when you have a sickness sort of get put into that scenario, it can be very bad very quickly. That's what happened to him. It's what happened last week. But it's something that I think people here are looking to try to change and try to reform media.
We on the progressive left, since Obama's election, we as the progressive left, meaning bloggers, journalists, activists, how have we fared in terms of pushing the agenda and forcing the White House to do what needs to be done? Or how can we improve?
This is the hard question, right? You don't really know what it is in a complex governing scenario that triggers action. We do know, I think, that if you look at issues like torture, like surveillance, some of the constitutional controversies from the Bush era that the Obama administration has generally not wanted to deal with, you can see, for example, from data that Pew has put out in tracking issues that are first identified in the blogosphere, citizen media, that then migrate or move over into traditional media and ultimately force policymakers to do something. I think those two examples I mentioned are areas where we've seen that happen. Obviously, more in the conservative echo chamber, we have seen through Breitbart and through the Drudge Report scenarios where stories that really weren't getting attention suddenly become national scandals. I think the most problematic version of that most recently is this entire made-up story about this so-called New Black Panther Party and charges that were dropped against someone. We're talking about one single criminal case that was dropped, which Fox News basically single-handedly turned into a national story. And recently I saw one newspaper ombudsman saying, well, we should be covering this more because it's a big story, not thinking about whether it's a big story because there's something there. And so I do think that this conference, which has all these interesting sort of bloggers and activists assembled, is a place for people to talk about that and doing it with ground rules. That is something that's factual, something that's true, something that is somehow certifiably important, and not just chasing after the most recent scandal that may not actually have any there.
Ed Schultz told us yesterday that he thinks that Obama ought to use MSNBC to try to dispel the message to his base in ways that Bush and Cheney have used and continue to use Fox News. What do you think about that?
Well, I think what he said, and I asked actually Van Jones about it in our keynote session today, was that basically part of the problem in the crises and the sort of 24/7 sensational box that the administration has had to operate in is that they have empowered and responded a lot to people that are definitely their political opponents. I think Fox News has a place in the debate, but I think their place is a partisan, agenda-driven organization. And so the question for the president and his aides is how much do they want to be engaging those opponents? And sometimes you do have to directly engage opponents. Sometimes it's good to go have a man-to-man or person-to-person with Bill O'Reilly. But other times you have to be careful about not only responding to your most disingenuous and in some cases lying critics. And so I think what Ed Schultz was arguing is that they've gone way too far in that extreme. Meanwhile, Ed says he can't get Obama to do an interview, whereas Obama did an interview with Fox News' Brett Baier. So, I don't think there's a black and white answer of, you're never going to respond to an opponent or you're never going to respond to critical media. And I think the media should be critical. But there is definitely a perception here, here in this conference in Las Vegas among bloggers and activists, and obviously what Ed said, that the administration is not hitting the right balance and that you've got to spend time communing with your base and telling your stories. At the end of the day, most people still respond to the news as a set of stories. And if you're not telling good stories to people that understand your character, that understand your goals, you're going to have a much harder time getting that story out to the wider public. And so I think that's something the administration's got to think on, yeah.
Compare this Netroots Nation conference to past Netroots Nations. And what, if anything, is missing from this conference?
Well, we are in Vegas again, which is where the first one was. So that always makes it just a little more crazy and weird. Everyone's like running around and there's gambling and there's, all these laptops and people who are generally pretty techy, but they're in this sort of digital Candyland environment, and at night Vegas is just a funny place. So that's always weird. But I think the mood is a bit more somber. I think that people have risen and fallen in this community as compared to the first one 5 years ago. Now there are people here who have genuinely made it. They have political voice, or they've published books, or they've really made it in a more conventional way than they had when they were just sort of citizen media. And so that's great, and I think there's a recognition of that success. At the same time, there's a real disappointment with the politics of the day. But that's not, I don't think, when you think about it, that's not unique to this community. I think America's pretty disappointed with the politics of the day.
Mm-hmm. Any of your own work that you want to tout right now?
I would never, try to get attention for links? No, I mean, I just did a piece yesterday that's on thenation.com that was about some of the racial conversations here. That was interesting, and James Rucker, who's from Color of Change, was talking about their efforts to hold Glenn Beck accountable. Glenn Beck, who famously accused the president of being a racist and said he has a deep-seated hatred for white culture. That's Glenn Beck's view, and that's something that people should remember and factor into the other things that he says. So James Rucker was talking about that effort, and other people were talking about some of the racial tension around the last week's news. And then someone in the audience, I sort of closed the piece by quoting someone in the audience who said, hey, we're not here to complain about the status quo. We got involved in this to create new voices and to amplify new voices. So let's spend less time on Glenn Beck and more time pushing forward the people we want to be advocates. And he said, well, if we're not doing that, then we just need to slow down and have a conversation with ourselves, because that's what this is about. I sort of closed the piece with that quote, which I thought was a good summation of what this kind of citizen media is about.
Going forward, what do we as the progressive media community here, what are our next steps in the next 1 to 3 months?
Well, I think obviously there's going to be tremendous attention on the midterms, and that's when the dirty tricks pile up even more. So I think there has to be a real aggressive fact-checking and accountability mechanism for people who care about trying to get ahead of these scandals. It doesn't have to be rinse, repeat. It doesn't have to be another Breitbarting every time this happens. I think there are, to use a corny term, there are teachable moments. So I think the citizen media, especially in the run-up to the elections, can be very good about holding people accountable, both parties and all types of media. I don't just mean calling out, whichever cable channel you might dislike more, but really trying to play a role in this real-time fact-checking. I think that's what we're seeing as a real crisis of sorts, at least for modern journalism.
Ari Melber from The Nation, thanks for appearing on the UpTake. Enjoy the pool.
Thanks.